an Excelsior Studios original production. You've heard a lot over the last 7 episodes. Stories of financial fraud, sexual assault allegations, suicidal ideations, and that doesn't begin to cover everything. This story clearly has a lot of elements, and a lot of them center around mental health. I want to make sure that I'm being extremely responsible when covering this story, by not ignoring Megan's mental health allegations, but also not making excuses for Megan's past behavior and actions by blaming it all on mental health. So today, I've called in an expert to help us understand the conditions Megan has claimed to have publicly, and see how these conditions may or may not have impacted her actions and behavior in some of the stories we've heard throughout the show. I'm Amanda, and this is Don't Waste This Effing Podcast, the story of Megan Stoner.
So my name is Devorah, and I am a licensed mental health provider. I have a master's in counseling psychology, but I also have 2 bachelor degrees. One happens to be in criminology, law, and society, so it has a very forensic and judicial background of a degree. And of course, the other bachelor's is in psychology and social behavior.
So have you heard a story like Megan's before, or come across anyone like her in, either your studies or your practice?
So have I heard stories exactly like Megan's? No. Her story certainly is very layered, very multifaceted, and it's kind of everywhere. It's very erratic. Do we have patients that are erratic, have multiple layers, multifaceted narratives and stories of lying or depression, anxiety, PTSD? Yes. Her story is quite unique, but I also don't want people to think it's so unique that it doesn't happen often. Because in therapy, typically a patient will feel like, I'm the only one going through this, or I'm the only one that's ever experienced this, or I'm the only person ever diagnosed with it. And that isn't the case. So I just always want to have that be at the forefront. Like, actually, everybody's kind of going through it. But yeah, her case is certainly up there.
So I want to go through the conditions that Megan has said publicly or on court documents that she has, but I want to be very clear. Neither of us have, Devorah's not treated Megan. She's not intending to diagnose Megan. Nothing about this is all just pure speculation based on what Megan has said. And Megan has portrayed herself as a public figure for almost 10 years now on social media, both in being an advocate for mental health and being a political public figure. So I want to go into kind of what she said that she has. So the first thing that she says is that she had PTSD. She did a podcast appearance called Mirror Talk, where she talked about being diagnosed with PTSD at age 19 due to sexual assaults from age 14 to 17 that she did not realize were sexual assaults until the age of 18. And she blames a powerful man in Indiana for doing that. We now believe that is her false accusation of former Speaker Bosma. So can you talk about what is PTSD, and do you see any behaviors from Megan that are exhibited that align with PTSD?
Okay, so post-traumatic stress disorder occurs when a person is exposed to either death, threatened death, actual or threatened serious injury, actual or threatened sexual violence. And even as an example, those that went through September 11, a lot of them have PTSD, a lot of the survivors. But you know who else has PTSD, or who other people that have PTSD from 9/11 are actually people that just saw it on the TV. So it doesn't have to be direct. It can be in that way as well. So post-traumatic stress disorder, yeah. It can be direct exposure or witnessing the trauma. Right. Or even learning that a relative or close friend was exposed to trauma. That can elicit that stressing response. So the first criteria is we need a stressor. And again, like I said, indirect exposure to adverse details of a trauma, like even in the course of professional duties, you've got your first responders, medics, right? They see something and it's just horrific. That's a stressor. So the first thing that we need for PTSD is a stressor. The second thing that we need for PTSD is a symptom of intrusion. So what are we experiencing? Are we experiencing unwanted or like horrifically upsetting memories? Are we getting nightmares or flashbacks? Are we experiencing traumatic reminders after this exposure in a way that distresses us emotionally? Or are we having some physical reactivity? And we only need one of those to see that, oh, potentially we're experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder. And then, of course, we've got a few more. So then we have avoidance. So, of course, we want to avoid any stimuli that is trauma related. As an example, someone is in a horrid car accident, right? They may not want to drive, and it may take 12 months to get back behind the wheel. So there's an avoidance. And what's interesting is I do wonder, it kind of makes me wonder, is that one of her coping mechanisms, right, with whatever happened to her in her past, avoiding the past, and then allowing herself to find a way to seek attention about sexual assault as she was older. So it's very interesting because avoidance is one of those things that is required for PTSD. The other thing is a negative impact on your cognition and mood, right? So it could be overly negative thoughts, assumptions about oneself or the world, exaggerated blame of yourself or others for causing trauma. You can have a negative affect. You can lose interest in activities, right? A couple of those. You need two of those to be, to kind of fall into place of PTSD. And there's a couple more, I think. Difficulty experiencing positive affect, and then just, and inability to recall key features of trauma. Then we have this other criterion, right? It says how we are either aroused or reactive, and what changes we see. So like irritability, aggression, risky, destructive behaviors, hypervigilance, heightened startle reaction, difficulty concentrating, difficulty sleeping. So we're already hearing some words, some concepts that can absolutely be applied to Megan. Then we have a duration. So in order to actually be diagnosed with PTSD, you have to have symptoms that last for more than 1 month, and then continue from there. Otherwise, if something is less than 2 weeks, it's actually called acute stress disorder. And then the other criterions are that it has to have some kind of significance in your functioning. So it either distresses you in some way socially, occupationally, etc. And then that symptoms obviously aren't due to a medication, substance use, or other illness. So those are the criterion for post-traumatic stress disorder. And then there's two specifications, right? Whether there's a dissociative specification or a delayed one. So when I kind of sum it up like that, what are you hearing that kind of matches either the potential that she was diagnosed with this or behaviors that she's had?
A lot of the behaviors that you talked about, like aggressive and a lot of that kind of stuff, that really seems to resonate with the story. I wonder, though, when you talk about avoidance, would you say that being on social media would be a good treatment for PTSD?
If I had someone with PTSD and their particular trauma had to do with, I have been bullied on social media, potentially a homework assignment would be, I want to desensitize you. So I want you to go on social media 1 minute a day the first week, 2 minutes a day the second week, 3, right? So to desensitize how bad the symptoms are of the PTSD. But if I were to answer your question directly, like, it would be no. You're not going to spend hours on social media. Well, unless the social media happens to be the avoidant behavior. So instead of actually dealing with real life, social media is the avoidant behavior.
So when she gave this interview, she said how she deals with the PTSD is social media. And I thought that was interesting because I've not been through a ton of therapy in my life, but I can't fathom a therapist saying to spend more time online. No. Typically it's the opposite. So I thought that was interesting.
Well, especially if in her online world, she was experiencing, somebody bullying her or accusations, those would be stressors. It would re-trigger her symptomology of PTSD. So absolutely, right. If she's actually being treated for PTSD and the PTSD is not related to being online, obviously we're looking at other potential aggravating stressors, that's not a typical homework assignment. Hey, go spend some time on social media. Why don't you? Like
Right.
there's a disconnect there for me. So yeah, I agree with you.
So the next would be borderline personality disorder. And this is the one that I think, when I've looked these up, this one seems to be the one that makes the most sense for me. But can you go into a little bit about what is borderline personality disorder?
Yeah, absolutely. So borderline personality disorder is a pervasive pattern of instability in interpersonal relationships, in the self-image of someone, and that the way that if it affects their affect, their emotional stability. And we see that extreme impulsivity beginning by early adulthood, and then it kind of presents in various ways or contexts. There are certain criteria that you have to meet. I believe there are 9 total. You have to meet 5. So the criteria are frantic efforts to avoid real or imagined abandonment. The next one is a pattern of unstable and intense interpersonal relationships characterized by alternating between extremes of idealization or devaluation. The next one is identity disturbance, marked by persistent, unstable self-image or sense of self. The next one would be impulsivity in at least 2 areas that are potentially self-damaging. So it could be substance abuse, sex addiction, spending addictions, reckless driving, binge eating, etc. And then actually it also includes suicidal ideation and self-mutilating behaviors. Then the next criterion is actual recurrent suicidal behavior, gestures, threats, or self-mutilating behavior. Number 6 would be affective instability. So due to, and you will see a marked reaction of their mood. So you can have an intense episode of dysphoria and then irritability or anxiety that lasts a few hours or a few days. And then we will see the polar opposite the next moment. Chronic feelings of emptiness, inappropriate, intense anger, or difficulty controlling anger. So we'll see that in temper tantrums or physical fights. And the next one, the last one, is transient stress-related paranoid ideation or severe dissociative symptoms. So 5 of those have to be present. And in the story with Megan, we see, I think, all of those.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we do.
Yeah.
So, can you talk about what is a normal treatment for borderline? Like, how do you treat that?
The first thing, well, it's actually interesting because do people with borderline personality disorder actually access care? And the answer, unfortunately, is rarely.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And the other thing, and if any people in my field are listening, I remember learning this from a mentor when I was accruing my hours to get licensed. But if you feel completely exhausted after a session and you're wondering why, consider borderline personality disorder as the potential of why. So treating BPD obviously has, there are many forms of treatment.
It's a complicated treatment.
Yeah. Borderline personality disorder is so complex and there's so many layers that each person with that particular diagnosis would be receiving a multitude of different techniques being utilized. So we have dialectical behavior therapy as an example, which is evidence-based. And we have found that it does help people with BPD to better their interpersonal relationships, to take more accountability, to reduce, the mood disorder or the suicidal ideations. So this dialectical behavior therapy, or what we call in our world DBT, happens to be a really great approach, right? Then we have other treatments like cognitive behavioral therapy. We want to do emotional regulation training. We want to ensure that there's just talk therapy in general and validate and normalize. There's another therapy called schema therapy that sometimes works. The other thing is with borderline, if we don't see a shift, right? If we're not seeing a change, then we certainly want to seek psychiatric assistance and try to determine if a pharmaceutical intervention would be helpful. And the reality is that with most diagnoses, if you are receiving psychiatric treatment, meaning when I say that, I just mean meds being prescribed and not seeing a therapist, healing is extremely difficult. Like it usually takes either longer or there isn't much movement. So for borderline personality disorder, the best treatment is typically therapy along with a pharmaceutical intervention.
So you had an interesting statistic about how many people would you say in jails suffer from borderline?
Yeah, so the NIH has a study about criminal behavior and borderline personality disorder, and there's definitely a correlation. 25 to 50% of incarcerated individuals suffer from borderline personality disorder. So that's huge. That is huge.
Yeah.
We don't typically see percentages like that for for disorders in prison. Like we will see depression, large numbers, we'll see anxiety, but personality disorders, let's see, it's mind-boggling that the number is 25 to 50%.
And do jails treat for that?
Yes, county, city, and federal prisons are supposed to treat patients with mental health diagnoses. Unfortunately, each of those systems and the entire prison system isn't well staffed to ensure that everyone is getting treatment. So yes, they do treat, especially if somebody has that diagnosis prior to entering the system. And it is the prison's responsibility to treat while that person is in their care. But it's just mental health disorders are such a huge part of the incarcerated population, and there's not enough money to pay staff psychiatry and therapy and case management. So yeah.
And then one more question. When we get into this, would you say that cases like this probably have a high attrition rate?
Yes. This is a very high potential case to reoffend.
Okay.
Especially if we're not hearing really personal and empathic, remorseful statements that are genuine. We're going to see some sort of offense happen again, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So I think just people should always keep that in mind, right? Proceed with caution. And with this particular story and the intensity at the rate at which Megan seems to create very false narratives, I think people in the future should truly proceed with caution. It's not bad to be someone's friend that has borderline personality disorder, but when there isn't any remorse and they're not apologetic and it doesn't feel very genuine, what are you really getting out of that relationship?
And just a thought I'm having right now is if money is tight or if insurance isn't available, that probably gets significantly harder, right?
Yes,
just in general for anything, yeah.
Yes, there are nonprofits that treat for free. For example, in Los Angeles County, you can actually go to the county and there are mental health centers where the county will pay for treatment. But yes, when you are anything when it comes to healthcare financially, if you're strapped, is hard to access.
Right.
Yeah.
So next one is opposition defiance disorder. What do you see anything like that with Megan, and kind of what is that?
Yeah, it's interesting. Oppositional defiance disorder usually is diagnosed in childhood, sometimes in teens, right? And then it's not something that typically gets diagnosed later in life. It's actually quite rare. So do I see oppositional defiance disorder in Megan? I do see symptomology. I'm curious, though, if it started when she was a child or 18. Mm-hmm. So it's a behavior condition, right? Where a child typically will display a continuing pattern of uncooperative, defiant, hostile behavior, especially toward people of authority. I actually treated a young man once, and in every aspect of his life, he was rageful and violent, and the only person that he was calm with was me, and his parents were so grateful. And it was interesting to see why me coming in, provided like a buffer or something. It was very interesting to experience, but it's very common for children, especially those 2 to 3 year old in their early teens, to be oppositionally defiant of authority once in a while. That's normal. That is what we typically would see. That is not a diagnosis, right? Because we hear kids talking back or not following their teacher's instructions. But in order to have that diagnosis be placed upon a person, the behavior has to last longer than 6 months and would go beyond what's usual for a child's developmental age, like where they are developmentally. The majority of kids or teens that have this particular diagnosis also have at least one other mental health condition. Okay. So we'll see oppositionally defiant children very aligned with children who have ADHD or anxiety or learning difficulties, mood disorders or impulsive control disorders. So about 30% of kiddos with this diagnosis develop a more serious behavioral condition called conduct disorder. If oppositional defiance disorder and conduct disorder continue into adulthood, it's because it wasn't properly diagnosed or treated.
Okay.
Which is really sad because sometimes you've got really permissive parents not realizing that there's something more happening. Mm-hmm. So I'm curious, maybe there's some opposite, there's conduct disorder there, right? Maybe that she's breaking rules. Did she run away from home when she was young? Did she stay out late? Did she skip school? Because that would be like conduct disorder. Was she aggressive in a way that causes harm, like bullying, fighting, or being cruel to animals? And then, obviously lying, stealing, or damaging. So do I think that these behaviors or diagnosis would typically align with what she experienced? I don't know her as a child, so I can't truly say for sure, that's there.
From the people I spoke to who knew her as a child, she seemed pretty typical, but she would like kind of be dramatic, and she wouldn't get punished for a lot. And I don't know I couldn't find enough people to talk to see if that was a behavioral condition or if that was just a kid whose parents didn't punish her very much, And so that's kind of interesting.
Yeah. Usually that diagnosis starts around age 8. So, and it can continue into adulthood, but it's rare to be diagnosed as an adult with that particular diagnosis.
So the last one was schizotypal personality disorder.
What makes you think she might be that she has that she may have schizophrenic,
I don't
criteria.
I don't see it, but I think she once claimed to have that. That was something else that somebody sent to me.
Well, it's interesting because schizotypal, it's a personality disorder as well. It's a mental health condition. It's marked by consistent patterns of intense discomfort with close relationships and social interactions. I do wonder, could that be there? Yeah. But I truly feel that her difficulty in her social interactions, that continued lying, probably was more related to borderline personality disorder. Mm-hmm. Because with schizotypal, with schizotypal personality disorder, if you have STPD, usually you have distorted views of reality, there's superstitions, grandiosity, there's more unusual behavior.
I mean, I see grandiosity for sure, but...
You know more of the story, so...
Grandiosity is there. I don't know about superstitions and things like that.
Yeah, usually those people will not have close friends or confidants. They will incorrectly interpret ordinary occurrences. Their speech may be odd, but all the things, those things also could be for someone with rejection sensitivity or dysphoria, and have ADHD. So
interesting.
Yeah, it's really interesting because when you are becoming a clinician in the world of psychology and you study the diagnosis manual and you get all this information, I promise you every student in that graduate class believes that they are every diagnosis, because you can see parts of yourself, right, acting in this way or that way, and you're like, oh, do I have that? But that's not the case. So in order to truly be diagnosed with something like this, you would have to meet multitude of criterion, and this is the more rare diagnosis, actually. So it's not as common.
Yeah. So then I think everybody these days says that everyone's a narcissist or a sociopath. There was a story where the police had to speak to her parents and told them that they saw no remorse after she falsely accused her pastors of inviting her to come engage in sexual activity with them when she was 11 years old. And then she denied it to the police when there was evidence that she texted somebody that. So, I believe the term he used was sociopath, because she didn't have remorse. She never got treatment that anybody can point to for that. Do you see sociopathy or narcissism anywhere here? Or is that kind of, I feel like they all kind of tie together to a point too.
You nailed it right there.
Okay.
I think that's like, boom, exactly what we're seeing. We have multiple, we are witnessing, right, through your storytelling and through her behaviors, certain things that tie together. What's interesting about sociopathic tendencies, let's say, is that we now call it, by the way, antisocial personality disorder. So it's very interesting because does she, for example, disregard, does she typically disregard other people, right? Does she typically break the law or act impulsively, or lack regard for her own safety or others, and have her symptoms lessen with age? So is it possible? Yeah. But we could also, by the way, these same things that are in the antisocial criterion also fall within borderline personality disorder.
Yeah.
And certainly narcissists, by the way.
Well, and I think everything you just said, she ticks every box. And it's getting worse with age, not better. So.
Yeah, it's interesting. The fact that she shows no regard. It's interesting.
Do you think Megan knows the difference between right and wrong?
I absolutely think Megan knows the difference between right or wrong. But if we're looking at someone as, a complete person, right, with decision-making capabilities and, hold on. I know that she knows the difference between right and wrong. My concern would be, is there a diagnosis that gets in the way of making decisions that are beneficial to her versus those that sabotage her or cause harm to others or herself?
Interesting.
And if she is doing wrong, how is she perceiving that, right? So it must be feeding something. It must be giving her something to continue participating in behaviors or actions that are harmful, right? A lie is harmful. A fake story that hurts other people is harmful. It's wrong. And so I definitely think that her definition is distorted, potentially. Like, she has a distorted view of what is right and wrong, and she certainly isn't using the measure of morality that, quote unquote, most people would in daily living.
When we talk about the measure of morality, one of the interesting things is she catches herself in these groups oftentimes of survivors of sexual assault or mental health advocates or a church community or different groups that are she's very good at co-opting the language. And so something that I'm worried about is, as she gets out, she kind of knows the language to use to say that she's, healing or she's getting better or something like that. And she can kind of use the correct language and lingo to kind of manipulate in a way. Do you have any thought or comment on that and how to treat someone like that?
Yeah, I think that's an important point to note, that Megan is really good at shape-shifting, right? So she chooses to be a sexual assault advocate, and the way she learns about how to say, what the story sounds like, is she puts herself or immerses herself in that group, and she co-ops other people's stories, or she co-ops or takes multiple stories in order to exaggerate something that may have happened to her. And mimicking is what we call it in the world of psychology, is part of a core feature, actually, of borderline personality disorder, because those individuals struggle with a consistent sense of self. So those individuals often struggle with a consistent sense of self. So they adopt characteristics of those around them to form an identity. So if she immersed herself in another group, right, she will take on those characteristics. So she gets people to buy into who she is, and then that buy-in validates that lack of sense of self-worth or identity. You asked another question after, how do you treat that, right? When it comes to treating mimicking, we need to teach people, when it comes to mimicking, or when it comes to searching for an identity among others and then claiming that identity or co-opting those identities, it's a lack of a coping mechanism to manage fears of abandonment. So the treatment would be to increase her coping skills and her management of any fear, but certainly because it's very prevalent and probably one of the top features of BPD, that fear of abandonment. So we certainly want to address those two things.
Yeah.
So interestingly, people that have been diagnosed with borderline personality disorder instinctively mirror to fit in, because without that behavior, we have no idea what will happen. So we call it like the chameleon effect. It is a part of borderline personality disorder. And and people get lured in because what that person is saying. So what Megan, the words that Megan will use, I'm gonna try. This is actually interesting because I didn't bring it up before, and I think it's an important aspect of who she is. Yeah. So let me do this. An interesting aspect of borderline personality disorder is the chameleon effect, mimicking or mirroring people. And since she doesn't have, or since I wonder if she even has a solid sense of identity, I would say that the way that she creates her identity is by mimicking. And it allows her to draw people in because people see themselves reflected in her own story that she's creating. So she's copying behaviors, actions, and narratives, and the people that are supporting her in, let's say, a Facebook group see themselves in her story or in her narrative. So it's totally extremely it can cause so much pain when that the person that is unsuspecting realizes, wait a second, that's not who they are. They're someone completely different. And I think those that may have interacted with Megan might have some of that, might feel that betrayal because of the way that borderline personality disorder and that diagnosis, the people that suffer from this diagnosis. And gosh, I just feel bad. How do I say this?
It's okay.
A part of me feels bad for those that were lured in by her mimicking and mirroring, because they were doing it with compassion and empathy. And I can see, why people would be angry that they bought into a story or a narrative that is not true.
Right, totally. And I think that's a big part of, if a girl steals a couple $100 from someone, I don't think that there's a huge Facebook group made about them and a podcast made about them. I think the fact that Megan did it so much to so many groups for so long and people feel so wronged by her, that's the reason we're in the position we're in today. Is because she's so good at it, she's so good at the mimicking. She successfully manipulated people, and she got something out of it, and she did it over and over. Yeah. And the mirroring is actually an aspect of the narcissism that coincides with borderline personality disorder. So anyone who gets a diagnosis of narcissistic personality disorder or narcissism as a diagnosis, we see this effect as well, and it's called narcissistic mirroring. So it's really interesting because all these little tidbits you start seeing, or you start being able to build a connection of how Megan might have been thinking as she created all those different stories and got all those different groups buy in to her narrative. Yeah. So I know sexual assault and lying about sexual assault is very common among women. A lot of women have been sexually assaulted in the past, but it's very uncommon to lie about it. I believe this statistic is like 97% of sexual assaults reported are the truth. But Megan lies about sexual assault, and she admits that she lies when she's kind of caught. So Do you see that in any of the kind of personality disorders that Megan has claimed to have had? Do you see anything there?
Yeah, absolutely. You're right that it is extremely uncommon for people to lie about sexual assault. The statistic does range from 2 to 10%, but the average is about 97% all true. So why would she do that, right? What is it about a sexual assault story that is appealing? And it's because it's traumatic. And when you share something so vulnerable, you really are able to engage people, to care about you, to have empathy for you. So the thing that she wanted the most was to not be abandoned and to feel like she's a part of a community. And when you share a story like sexual assault, it's the most vulnerable of vulnerable stories that you can share with a group of strangers, right? People of the unknown, people that you're trying to make friends. It's such a vulnerable and intimate type of experience. So I do wonder, did she create that narrative because that helped her feel this intimacy with these groups, right? The closeness, that these groups might have truly been a part of her. And then I wonder also why she doesn't feel bad for co-opting other people's pain. And where is that remorse? Because to steal a sexual assault story, right? Or to co-opt multiple stories and make it your own. And then people find out that you've lied, and then you admit that you have lied. That's so hurtful.
Right. Have you ever heard in your practice about somebody being sexually assaulted at a young age or in any capacity, and then instead of coming forward with the true story, accusing others or like using other people's stories instead of their own story?
I'm going to say that, do I see patients that don't disclose their sexual assault? Just to that answer is yeah. But when you add that second component of your question, do they not disclose but then take on the narrative of someone else's assaults? That's rare.
Because this is the
Okay, 'cause
second case I've heard where somebody does this, and to me as a woman, I know so many women who have experienced something too, and I can't fathom lying, I guess.
that, yes, me neither.
Or like even like how evil something like that is, to accuse a man who didn't do that, you know? Like to put that on someone, like to put such an evil thing on someone innocent. I can't fathom doing that.
Not only did she accuse someone, and it's unfathomable, right? The accusations, but she chose someone that had stature. And it makes a person wonder, what was she seeking, right? What was she trying to get out of harming someone of stature? And one of the things that comes to mind is, well, then more people would buy into her narrative. More people would be aware. More people would know of who she is. And I think, again, she fears not having relationships. She fears abandonment. So why not be grandiose in the exaggerations or the lies? Because she can lure and draw more people into her story that way. But she's a chameleon. So it could be sexual assault. It could be something else. She will do the same thing unless she gets help. And I pray for her for that.
With the last thing I'll just ask is, so a lot of people think that this comes from somewhere. Something happened at a young age that made her this way. I think that do you have a comment on that? I think a lot of people experience trauma and don't go steal tens of thousands of dollars from people and falsely accuse people of horrific crimes. I think it's kind of a cop-out to say that, but are there common experiences that people have that then grow up to have borderline, or common traits that they have?
So are there common reactions to trauma or shock? Yes, but at the same time, each person responds to their trauma in a unique way. Do people who are traumatized, are they more likely to commit offenses? Yes. Is that the norm of behavior? We don't typically harm others in the way that Megan has, because we were traumatized. There are common reactions to this kind of trauma or shock, but at the same time, it's obvious that each person responds to their trauma in their own unique way. Yeah. I say Megan is at the extreme. If truly there was sexual assault as a child, it's an extreme case. And trauma does not justify harming people. If I am traumatized, that does not give me the right to create harm in other people's lives. So when you ask, do we see that? Yeah, we see that. We do see it in the clinical world. Sexual assault survivors can go out and commit offenses like sexual assault. Actually, in men, we see that a lot. When men are sexually assaulted as children, we do see them offend as adults because it's a repetitive, it's a trauma response and behavior or output that can happen. Is it common to be as extreme as Megan has been? No. I hope the audience can sense that this is an extremely delicate topic, right? And I'm trying to gently express the trauma of sexual assault and the outcomes that can follow. And I hope I did an okay job. So that's the only thing
you totally
that
did. Totally.
Okay, because I want to be gentle with it.
No, it's a hard. I know actually something you've said to me before that I don't know that we talked about. You've said that it could be actual. It doesn't have to be an actual experience. It could be perceived experience. So Megan could have experienced something growing up that we wouldn't perceive as trauma that then impressed on her trauma.
All humans experience life through their own perception, their own lens. So if Megan perceived something to be traumatic, it was traumatic. And everyone else in humanity does not have to agree with that perception. So someone's trauma is absolutely based on their perceptive lens.
So that's it for today. I hope this helps you better understand what Megan may be dealing with, but also what impact her alleged conditions may or may not have on her actions in daily life. This is all in the lead up to next week's episode, where we go into what is, in my opinion, Megan's worst offense of last summer, and maybe in general, as well as the scheme we put together in order to catch Megan, which was ultimately successful. You won't want to miss that, but for now, I'm Amanda. This is Don't Waste This Effing Podcast, the story of Megan Stone.